Hey everyone, I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and in this video, I'm going to explain why Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson is wrong about God. So I was browsing YouTube the other day, as I often do, and came across a little 2-minute video of Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson giving his opinion about God's existence. Well, since it's a relatively short video, it's only 2 minutes long, I'm actually going to play the whole thing out for you, and then I'll give my response in its entirety afterwards. Before I play the clip, this is just a quick reminder that I currently support my wife and 2 kids through this ministry, so if you find value in the work that I do on Capturing Christianity, please consider supporting me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/capturingchristianity. For $5 a month, you can gain early access to videos just like this one. And you can also gain access to a private Facebook group called the Bereans, where I post really cool videos and do little private chats for everybody in there. So make sure to check me out on patreon.com/capturingchristianity. Now, if you can't support me financially, but you'd still like to support my ministry, then you can do that by liking this video, subscribing to my channel, and even sharing these videos with your friends. Thank you in advance, no matter what you do, even if you're just watching. So thank you. All right, let's watch the clip from Dr. Tyson.
The more I look at the universe, just the less convinced I am that there is something benevolent going on. So if your concept of a creator is someone who's all powerful and all good, that's not an uncommon pairing of powers that you might ascribe to a creator. All powerful and all good. And I look at disasters that afflict Earth and life on Earth. Volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, disease, pestilence, congenital birth defects. You look at this list of ways that life is made miserable on Earth by natural causes. And I just ask, how do you deal with that? So philosophers rose up and said, if there is a God, God is either not all powerful or not all good. I have no problems if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump up into the bearded man. If that shows up, we're good to go. Okay? Not a problem. There's just no evidence of it. And this is why religions are called faiths, collectively. Because you believe something in the absence of evidence. That's what it is. That's why it's called faith. Otherwise, we would call all religions evidence. But we don't, for exactly that reason. So I'm given what everyone describes to be the properties that would be expressed by an all-powerful being in the gods that they worship. I look for that in the universe and I don't find it. So I remain unconvinced. But if you've got some good evidence, bring it, bring it, bring it.
Now, Dr. Tyson doesn't claim to be an expert on religion, but in our society, if you are a scientist or even dress like a scientist, your opinion on religion suddenly carries a lot more weight. And so what we're going to see throughout this video is that being an expert in science doesn't necessarily translate to being an expert in religion. I'm going to make 3 main points in my response. First, I'm going to argue that his claim that there's no evidence for God is false. Second, I'm going to argue that his treatment of faith is misguided. And third, I'm going to argue that Dr. Tyson's views on religion lack sophistication. To start things off, let's review what Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson says about the evidence for God's existence.
I have no problems if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump up into the bearded man. If that shows up, we're good to go. Okay? Not a problem. There's just no evidence of it.
Now, I know that Dr. Tyson is using like a little boomer humor here, but I feel like I should still point out that Christians have never thought about God as like a bearded man floating around in the clouds in the sky. 1 Timothy 6:16 says that no one has seen or can see God. And the Old Testament even forbids making images or idols of God for purposes of worship. See Exodus 20:4-5 and Deuteronomy 4:15-16. But the main thing I want to focus on in this video is his claim that there's no evidence for God. Well, in fact, I did a whole video in response to this claim from another atheist, so if you want to give that a watch, check for it in the description. Now first, Dr. Tyson's assertion that there's no evidence for God is just a little bit ironic since he didn't give any evidence that there's no evidence for God's existence. If theists can't just claim that God exists and get away with it, Dr. Tyson can't just claim that there's no evidence for God and get away with it. There's no rule in philosophy or in anything that says only theists are responsible for defending the things that they claim. Second, the claim that there's no evidence for God is just a myth. It's kind of like the saying, An apple a day keeps the doctor away. It might be fun to say, but in reality, apples don't keep doctors away, and in reality, there's loads of evidence for God's existence. Recently, a book came out called 24 or so Arguments for God, edited by Jerry Walls, if you can see it, and Trent Doherty. This book features dozens of peer-reviewed articles from dozens of PhD philosophers giving arguments and evidence for God's existence. Now, some of the arguments in here are new, and that's really exciting, but many of the ideas, the core ideas focused on in this book, have been around for centuries. For example, the contingency argument for God's existence has been around since at least the 9th century and has been talked about by philosophers ever since. So when Dr. Tyson says there's no evidence for God, really what he's doing is he's announcing his unfamiliarity with philosophy. The reason that this is important is because it highlights the fact that being a scientist doesn't make him a trustworthy source of information when it comes to evidence for God's existence. We shouldn't believe what he says about religion just because he's a scientist. Third, if you notice toward the end of the video, Dr. Tyson issued a challenge, and I'd like to take him up on it. If you recall, he says,
But if you got some good evidence, bring it, bring it, bring it.
Bring it!
Now, unfortunately, I haven't been doing this for
20 years.
Apparently that's the cutoff, but I'll give it a shot. In what follows, I'm going to lay out 3 pieces of evidence that I think support theism over naturalism. The first piece of evidence is the existence of dependent things. Everything in our experience exists dependently. This mug on my desk, for example, depends on other things for its existence. It hasn't always been here, it was built. My computer, my speakers, my headphones, my house, literally everything that we come in contact with depends on something else for its existence. And here's the really interesting thing about this is that if you think about reality as a whole, all of reality exists independently. There can't be an outside explanation of everything that exists. That's actually impossible. Now, the reason why this is puzzling is because in the same way that you can't build a brick house out of water, you can't get an independent existence out of dependent things. Dr. Josh Rasmussen, who I've had on the channel a bunch, he calls this a construction problem. Adding more and more dependent things together doesn't suddenly make the group independent. A group of 10 cameras, for example, is not suddenly independent because you have a group of 10. But again, the question is, how can all of reality exist independently when the building blocks of reality that we're familiar with exist dependently? The solution to this problem of dependence, as it's known in the literature, is to posit a necessary foundation that has its existence independently. The reason that reality in total is independent, even though everything we experience is dependent, is because there is a necessary thing at the foundation of reality that explains everything else. This solves the puzzle, and notice what we have here. We have a necessary thing at the foundation of reality. Now, I think that this necessary thing would actually have to be perfect in order to have the kind of independent existence that it has. But let's turn and look at 2 additional pieces of evidence that I think help flesh out this concept further, that this necessary foundation is both personal and good. The second piece of evidence that I'll touch on is called fine-tuning. The fact that our universe is life-permitting is actually remarkable. If the conditions of our universe were just slightly different, life couldn't evolve anywhere in the cosmos. Let's take an extreme example. Suppose that gravity for a moment didn't exist. Without gravity, there'd be no planets, no stars, no galaxies, nothing like what we see in our universe. Life can't exist in a universe where molecules don't stick together. Life needs an attractive force like gravity. But it doesn't just need any kind of gravity, it needs to be set at just the right strength. Physicists have estimated that if the strength of gravity had been just 1 part in 10 to the 60th stronger, then the universe would have just collapsed back in on itself right after the Big Bang. And if it had been 1 part in 10 to the 60th weaker, matter would have expanded too rapidly for stars and planets to form. Oh, and if you want a citation for these calculations, then check the link in the description. To put these numbers into perspective, getting the strength of gravity right for life by chance would basically be like the guy next to you at a poker table being dealt 10 royal flushes in a row by chance. I mean, it's technically possible that he's not cheating, like maybe he was dealt those hands fairly. But yeah, we all know that he was cheating. In the literature, there are about 10 to 12 cases of fine-tuning like this, and each one of these makes the problem worse and worse and worse for naturalism. Now, if you'd like to see my conversation with an actual cosmologist on all of the evidence for fine-tuning, check the link in the description. Now, just like it would be extraordinarily unlikely to be dealt 10 royal flushes in a row by chance, it would be extraordinarily unlikely that our universe would be life-permitting by chance. Now, the reason that this is evidence for theism is that it's not so unlikely or improbable that a good God would want to create a universe that can support life. And think of it like fingerprint evidence in a court case. The probability that any two people would have the same fingerprint is about 1 in a billion. So finding a matching fingerprint at the scene of the crime doesn't prove with 100% certainty that this person is guilty, but it provides pretty good evidence for guilt over innocence. And so pretty much in exactly the same way, fine-tuning provides very good evidence for theism over naturalism. Now, the third piece of evidence that I'll discuss is called moral knowledge. And before I proceed, let me just make a quick distinction here. Traditional moral arguments say that God is necessary, or in some cases, God is the best explanation of moral facts. Without God, these arguments say, we're not actually obligated to do what's right or wrong. But the argument for moral knowledge isn't about what grounds moral facts. Rather, this argument is about the knowledge of moral facts. Now, the reason that this distinction is important is because I'm not saying that God is necessary to ground objective morality. Maybe naturalism can account for moral facts. I don't know. What this argument focuses on is knowledge of moral facts. A few months ago, I interviewed a professional philosopher named Eric Wielenberg on his case for objective morality. As an atheist, he thinks there are really good reasons to think that we have knowledge of objective moral facts. For example, he claims that we know that it's objectively wrong to torture infants for fun. From this point forward, I'm going to assume that you've watched that interview and are now convinced that we do have this kind of moral knowledge. All right, with that out of the way, let's get to the argument. Now, on naturalism, it's quite surprising that unguided evolution would produce beings that have accurate beliefs about morality. Darwin actually realized the problem when he wrote, if, for instance, to take an extreme case, men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. On naturalism, it would be an inexplicable, miraculous coincidence if our beliefs about morality somehow track the truth. And that's not a coincidence that naturalists can reasonably accept. This is exactly what naturalist philosopher Sharon Street wrote in a recent article she wrote entitled, A Darwinian Dilemma for Realist Theories of Value. There she writes, allowing our evaluative judgments to be shaped by evolutionary influences is analogous to setting out for Bermuda and letting the course of your boat be determined by the wind and tides. Just as the push of the wind and tides on your boat has nothing to do with where you want to go, so the historical push of natural selection on the content of our evaluative judgments has nothing to do with evaluative truth. Of course, it's possible that as a matter of sheer chance, some large portion of our evaluative judgments ended up true due to a happy coincidence, but this would require a fluke of luck that's not only extremely unlikely in view of the huge universe of logically possible evaluative judgments and truths, but also astoundingly convenient. The link to Street's paper, if you want to read it, is in the description. Street's point is that evolution could have produced beings with any number of moral beliefs. It's therefore extremely unlikely that unguided evolution would just happen to produce beings with the correct set of moral beliefs. This would be like setting sail across the Atlantic Ocean with no steering mechanism and just happening to arrive at the right port. It's possible to do that, but it's just extremely unlikely. On theism, however, it's not so unlikely that a good God would want to create beings with reliable beliefs about morality. Since knowledge is good, and knowledge of right and wrong is good, a good God would want us to know right and wrong. And obviously, he'd know what cognitive equipment we would need in order to discover moral truth. Theism has the explanatory resources, in other words, to explain moral knowledge. In the same way that a life-permitting universe is strong evidence for theism, moral knowledge is strong evidence for theism. Now, in response to this third piece of evidence for moral knowledge, atheists will sometimes say that the God of the Bible can't actually be the good God that we're talking about here because he commanded really atrocious things in the Bible. Let me give 3 quick thoughts on this. First, this is a great rhetorical strategy because it's actually a really emotional subject, and so it has really high rhetorical appeal. Playing on people's emotions is actually a really effective strategy. Advertisers use it all the time. Second, while this objection is clearly worth thinking about and addressing, it's completely unrelated to my argument, like completely unrelated. Nothing in this argument at all requires the assumption that the Bible is the inspired word of God. In other words, this objection is actually kind of a way of avoiding my argument. Third, if you didn't know this, Christians have not been silent on these types of objections. Christian philosopher Paul Copan, for example, has a great book called Is God a Moral Monster?, where he addresses all of these kinds of objections. So by raising this objection, atheists aren't making like a definitive point against Christianity. Really what they're doing is just opening a real big theological can of worms. Now, if you'd like more of my thoughts on these types of objections to Christianity, make sure to check the link in the description. But my major point in response to this is that this is really just a red herring. I think Christians ought to have a good answer to these types of objections, but it's completely unrelated to my argument. Now, before I move on, I want to address another objection that I sometimes see from atheists, that God is just this really complex hypothesis. Some atheists even think that God is like the most complex hypothesis there is. Now, I personally think that this is bogus. Perfect being theism is actually remarkably simple. It postulates one being, God, with one property, perfection. But wait, the atheist might think, the reason that God is so complex is because it postulates an infinite God with an infinite mind. But in my view, I think that this is a misunderstanding of simplicity. The simplicity of a theory isn't actually measured by how much the theory entails. I mean, every theory actually entails an infinite number of propositions. The simplicity of a theory is measured by the concepts required to understand the theory. Compare perfect being theism with the naturalistic concept of an infinite multiverse. Perfect being theism postulates one object with one property, whereas the infinite multiverse postulates an infinite number of entities with trillions and trillions of particles, all with different properties. It's obvious to me, at least, which one of these theories is simpler. Moreover, note how perfect being theism compares to something like the flying spaghetti monster. The flying spaghetti monster is not simple. It's composed of many physical parts. It has a certain geometrical shape. It has arbitrary limits in size, power, knowledge, and so on. In an effort to make the flying spaghetti monster more analogous to God, atheists will sometimes remove the properties that make it complex in order to make it seem more like God. Oh, they'll say, my flying spaghetti monster has no limits in shape. It has no parts. It's unlimited in size and power and knowledge and so on. This was actually Professor Wolpert's strategy in his debate with Dr. William Lane Craig, but instead of the flying spaghetti monster, he appealed to a supercomputer. Let's watch.
Well, remember I gave an argument for thinking that this cause is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, and personal.
I think it's a computer.
Well, that wouldn't, computers are designed by people.
No, this is a self-designing computer.
Timeless.
Timeless.
Well, that's a contradiction in terms.
Why is it time? What's contradictory about it?
A computer has to function, it takes
Oh,
time.
no, this is a special computer.
Yeah, but it has to be logically coherent.
Oh, it's logically coherent.
Yes, you have to be logically coherent.
Oh, no, this computer is amazing.
No, besides, it would have to be, as I said, a personal being.
No.
A computer is a physical
Not this computer.
object.
Oh,
Well, then,
no.
Okay, see, what you're doing is what you're calling a computer is really God. A non-physical, It's just another word if you rob it of all the attributes that make it a computer.
As we can see in this clip, this strategy actually backfires. If you're going to remove all of the properties that make it distinct from God, you're not being clever, you're just calling God by a different name. And in my view, you're actually demonstrating that you can understand the simplicity of theism. Theism is not as complex as the flying spaghetti monster or supercomputer or infinite multiverse. That's why taking away these properties make the theory better and help it out. To quickly summarize my response to Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson's challenge, I've provided 3 pieces of evidence, dependent things, fine-tuning, and moral knowledge, that together provide strong evidence for theism over naturalism. I also argued that perfect being theism is a remarkably simple concept and therefore can't be objected to on the basis of complexity. If you want to see a lot more evidence for theism, then check the description. All right, I know that was a lot, but give me a break. Dr. Tyson literally said, "Bring it!" So I had to. So let me know what you think of my response to Dr. Tyson's challenge in the comments. All right, let's move on to the topic of faith. I'll play the relevant clip from Dr. Tyson again.
And this is why religions are called faiths, collectively. Because you believe something in the absence of evidence. That's what it is. That's why it's called faith. Otherwise, we would call all religions evidence. But we don't, for exactly that reason.
So obviously, we're looking at a little more boomer humor here, and I don't want to press him too hard on like an attempted joke. But I think this idea that if faith were evidence-based, then we would call religions evidence, I think that's pretty silly. Science is based on evidence, but we don't call different branches of science evidence. When referring to both chemistry and biology, we don't refer to that group as evidences. The joke is just a little too cringe or too boomerish for me. Now, boomer humor aside, Dr. Tyson is just wrong when he says that faith is believing something in the absence of evidence. That's actually not really how language works. Words don't have inherent meanings. Dictionaries are actually just historical records of how people normally or commonly use words. Now, if you're an English speaker and all you do is go around using words in really uncommon ways, you won't necessarily be right or wrong, like in a moral sense. You'll just be extraordinarily bad at communicating. But the point is that faith is not this rigid thing that Dr. Tyson seems to treat it as. Words can have multiple meanings, and meanings depend on the way that people actually use the terms. Now, of course, some people do use faith as belief in the absence of all evidence, but that doesn't mean that everyone uses it that way, and it doesn't mean that we should use it that way. One reason not to use it that way is that it's actually inconsistent with how the Bible treats the word faith. Theologians have noted that the biblical understanding of faith is actually something more akin to trust. And if you look at the etymology of the word, that's actually sort of what it means, trust or confidence. The Israelites, if you look at the Old Testament, had faith in God because they knew that God had come through for their ancestors time and time again. That theme is apparent through the entire Old Testament and even in the New Testament. Jews were confident in their religion because of what they thought God did for them in the past. That type of faith is trust because of evidence, not trust in spite of evidence. And if you think about it, if faith was at its best when you had no evidence, faith in Christianity would be at its absolute best if we had no record at all of what happened to the Jews or the early Christians. That'd be like the ultimate lack of evidence. But Christians love the Bible. They love learning about what God did. In other words, Christians love evidence. Oh, and by the way, testimony, which is what the Bible is a widely recognized and valid source of justification. Now, if you're finding it difficult to agree with what I'm saying here, that might be because you and I have different standards of evidence. Now, I don't want to comment too much on this because I actually plan on doing a video on standards of evidence, but I'll just say quickly that the correct standard of evidence is any data that supports one hypothesis over another. That is the standard of evidence that we use in science, in law, in philosophy, and in our everyday lives. But again, more on that in another video. Moving on, the last section of this video is dedicated to Dr. Tyson's seemingly unfamiliarity with contemporary thoughts on philosophy of religion. To give a little background here, most philosophers these days make a distinction between To give a little background here, most philosophers these days make a distinction between logical and evidential versions of the problem of evil. The logical version says that it's literally impossible that both God exists and evil exists at the same time. The evidential problem of evil doesn't necessarily say that God and evil are incompatible. Rather, what it says is that evil is evidence against God's existence. God and evil might be logically compatible, but it's nevertheless unlikely that both God and evil exist. With this distinction in mind, let's re-watch the following clip.
The more I look at the universe, just the less convinced I am that there is something benevolent going on. So if your concept of a creator is someone who's all-powerful and all good, that's not an uncommon pairing of powers that you might describe to a creator. All powerful and all good. And I look at disasters that afflict Earth and life on Earth. Volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, disease, pestilence, congenital birth defects. You look at this list of ways that life is made miserable on Earth by natural causes. And I just ask, how do you deal with that? So philosophers rose up and said, if there is a God, God is either not all-powerful or not all good.
The last thing that he says here is a perfect indication that he's raising the logical version of the problem of evil. Evil, in the form of like natural disasters, is inconsistent with God's nature. Evil, in other words, means that God can't be both all-powerful and all good. That is a claim of logical inconsistency. The reason that this is important is because most philosophers alive today, even atheist ones, admit that the logical version of the problem of evil has been answered. In The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism, atheist philosopher William Rowe says this: some philosophers have contended that the existence of evil is logically inconsistent with the existence of the theistic God. No one, I think, has succeeded in establishing such an extravagant claim. Indeed, granted incompatibilism, there is a fairly compelling argument for the view that the existence of evil is logically consistent with the existence of the theistic God. In the Oxford Handbook of Philosophical Theology, agnostic philosopher Paul Draper explains, Although logical arguments from evil seemed promising to a number of philosophers in the 1950s and 1960s, for example, Mackey, they are rejected by the vast majority of contemporary philosophers of religion. In order for a logical argument from evil to succeed, it is necessary to show that, for some known fact about evil, it is logically impossible for God to have a good moral reason to permit that fact to obtain. This, however, is precisely what most philosophers nowadays believe cannot be shown. In his amazing little book, God, Freedom, and Evil, Alvin Plantinga shows that God's existence is completely logically compatible with evil. And yes, even with natural evil. Oh, and by the way, this is one of the best books that you can get on philosophy of religion. This actually really opened my eyes to what good analytic philosophy looks like. So if you want to buy this one, check the link in the description. Professor Plantinga's main argument has come to be known as the free will defense. Here's a short clip of him explaining the basic idea.
Well, the free will defense roughly goes like this. God is omnipotent, but that doesn't mean that he can bring about just every possible state of affairs. So, for example, he can't cause it to be the case that I freely do something or other, freely give, say, $100 to my church. He can't cause me to do that freely. If he causes me to do it, I don't do it freely. So the free will defense says that, first of all, there are possible worlds in which there are free creatures who only do what is right. But maybe those worlds are ones that God can't create. But it could be that for any free creature you pick out, if God were to create that creature and put him in this in any particular circumstance you mentioned, any possible world you mentioned, that creature would do at least one wrong thing. Any creature like that would suffer from what I called trans-world depravity. Trans-world depravity says only that for any world in which God could have actualized you, you would perform at least one wrong action.
And that, therefore, God could not create a possible world in which there was no evil.
Therefore, he could not create a possible world in which there were free creatures but no evil.
So the basic idea is that, for all we know, it's impossible that God can create a world with free creatures that has no evil in it. And if the possibility that free will is valuable enough to outweigh the evil that comes with it, that possibility is enough to show that God and evil are logically coherent. But what about natural disasters, right? That's what Dr. Tyson was talking about. Those evils are not at all the result of free will, right? Now, actually, in the book, Plantinga argues that, however unlikely it might seem to our modern intuitions, it's at least possible that natural disasters like hurricanes and tornadoes are the result of free actions or free decisions made by supernatural agents like demons. And again, this idea might seem really odd or out of place with our modern intuitions, but the claim here is one merely about possibility, and that possibility is enough to show that God and evil are logically consistent. This is why most philosophers nowadays are going the evidential or probabilistic route. Oh, and by the way, God, Freedom, and Evil was published in 1974, so Dr. Tyson has had about 50 years to get up to speed on this. Now, of course, nothing that I've said so far addresses the evidential problem of evil. Even if God and evil are technically compatible, don't we still have evidence against God's existence? This was actually the subject of a formal debate that I did with a really intelligent atheist by the name of Justin Schieber. In that debate, Justin defended the evidential problem of evil. Check the link in the description if you want to give that one a listen. I was also interviewed on the problem of evil recently on the Bible Deaners podcast. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts on responding to the evidential problem, check the link in the description. In summary, we've looked at 3 different things that Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson is wrong about: evidence, faith, and evil. In response to his claim that there's no evidence for God, I pointed out that this is ironic since he gave no evidence that there's no evidence. Second, I showed that he's really just announcing his ignorance about philosophy since arguments for theism have been around for centuries. Third, I answered his challenge by giving 3 pieces of evidence that favor theism over naturalism: dependent things, fine-tuning, and moral knowledge. In response to Dr. Tyson's comments on faith, I pointed out that, first, meaning is determined by usage, and people use faith in ways that are consistent with evidence. Second, the biblical understanding of faith is more like trust. And then third, the fact that Christians love the Bible means that they actually love evidence, which implies that Christians don't necessarily think that faith and evidence are in conflict. In response to Dr. Tyson's comments on evil, I pointed out that Professor Alvin Plantinga's free will defense has led most philosophers of religion, including atheists, to reject the logical version of the problem of evil. It appears that Dr. Tyson is about 50 years behind in his thinking. Well, thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, like it, and subscribe to my channel. If you have a video from an atheist that you think deserves this level of analysis, make sure to let me know in the comments. Keep in mind that YouTube blocks links, so if you have a video, then make sure to just paste the title of it and let me know the author. All right, have a great day, guys. I'll see you later. Oh, and
by the way, Christianity is true.